The prairie had a way of carrying sound farther than a man expected, as though the flat land itself wanted to make sure no cry was lost to silence. That night, beneath a sky stretched wide with winter stars, a rancher rode his usual patrol along the edge of his property, the snow brittle beneath the hooves of his horse. He was 30 years old, though his face bore the quiet wear of years spent with only cattle and wind for company. His life had been one long stretch of routine, mending fences, hauling water, listening to the hollow echo of his own boots on cabin boards at night. He had grown used to the ache of solitude, the way it seeped into his bones like cold. At first, he thought it was nothing more than the cry of a coyote, carried thin across the night air. He paused, tilted his head, listening. It came again, sharper now, more desperate, and something in the sound twisted his gut. It was not the wild. It was human. The rancher urged his horse forward, the reins trembling in his hand. His heart had not beaten that hard in months, maybe years. The railway cut through the land not far from where he rode, a dark line of iron stretching endlessly in both directions. He had always hated it, the way it split the prairie as if men could carve straight lines across something so ancient and untamed. And it was there, in the gloom beside the steel, that he saw what would stay with him until his last breath. A young woman, bound cruelly to the frozen track, her dress torn and dirted, her head slumped forward as though she no longer had the strength to hold it high. She could not have been more than 22, yet life had pressed upon her a weariness that belonged to someone twice that age. Her hands were lashed behind her back, rope biting into her wrists. At her side, as though discarded like refuse, lay 2 swaddled bundles. He drew closer, and the faint cries pierced his chest like arrows. Infants. Tiny twins, their cheeks blue with cold, their breaths shallow, their lives hanging by threads as thin as spider silk. The rancher's mouth went dry. For a moment, he was frozen, staring, unable to make sense of cruelty so deliberate. Then instinct surged through him, swift and fierce. He swung from the saddle, boots crunching against the snow. The woman lifted her head slightly, her eyes dull with exhaustion but alive with a flicker of desperate hope. She tried to speak, but only a broken rasp escaped her lips. He pulled his knife from his belt and dropped to his knees. The railway rails hummed faintly beneath his hand. The sound chilled him deeper than the wind ever could. Somewhere in the distance, the train was coming. He saw it then, the faint light far off down the track, a star low to the earth, growing brighter. The rope resisted, coarse and tight, but he carved through it with quick, brutal slashes. His hand shook as the fibers frayed. The woman gasped as freedom returned to her limbs, though she could barely move them. He gathered her up first, then bent for the babies. Their cries had weakened, a sound so small and fragile it nearly broke him. He clutched them to his chest, their warmth faint but present, their tiny hearts beating against his palm. He hauled them all away from the rails, stumbling through snow that clung to his boots, just as the great iron beast thundered past. The ground trembled, sparks flared, smoke choked the air. He shielded them with his body, holding them close until the train was gone and silence returned, save for the wail of the prairie wind. The woman sagged against him, whispering something he could barely catch. It was thanks, but it sounded more like a prayer, fragile and trembling. He looked at her, her face drawn with hunger and fear, yet still carrying a quiet dignity. She had not given up entirely, not even when abandoned on the tracks. He knew in that moment that she had fought for the lives of her children with everything left in her. That willpower shone brighter than the cruel fate she had been dealt. For the first time in years, the rancher felt something move inside him, something long buried beneath dust and silence. He pressed the twins closer, shifted his arm to steady the young woman, and guided them toward his horse. The night air stung his lungs, but his steps were steady. He had no notion of what he was bringing into his life, no map for what lay ahead, only the certainty that he could not abandon them. When he lifted her onto the horse, she nearly collapsed into the saddle, clutching the babies with what strength remained. He mounted behind her, wrapping one arm carefully around her waist, the other steadying the reins. As the horse carried them toward the faint lantern light of his cabin in the distance, the rancher's mind wrestled with questions he could not answer. Who had done this? What kind of heart would leave a woman and her newborn twins tied to cold iron, left to die beneath steel wheels? The questions gnawed at him, but the night offered no reply. The only sound was the faint whimper of the twins and the low whistle of the wind as snowflakes drifted past their faces. He knew the prairie could be merciless, but cruelty of this kind was man-made. It burned in his chest like a coal he could not extinguish. At last, the cabin came into view, a dark shape against the frozen earth, its chimney standing like a sentinel. He swung down, carried the woman in his arms as though she weighed nothing, and pushed open the door with his shoulder. The warmth of the fire he had left smoldering greeted them, a fragile promise of safety. He laid her gently on the cot by the wall, spread a blanket over her trembling frame, then took the twins and placed them before the fire, his hands awkward but careful. The woman's eyes fluttered open once more. For a heartbeat, he thought she might speak, but exhaustion dragged her into sleep. The rancher crouched beside the fire, watching the tiny chests of the babies rise and fall. Each breath was a victory, each cry a declaration that life still clung to them. The rancher leaned back against the wall, the shadows playing across his worn features. He had saved them from the train, but he knew this was only the beginning. Whoever had left them there might not consider their task unfinished. And even if no one came, the woman and her children were now tied to his fate, as much as the tracks had once held them. He did not know her story. He did not know why she had been left to die. But he knew the prairie better than most, and it had taught him one thing: when a life is placed in your hands, you do not let it slip away. The fire crackled softly, the twins whimpered in their sleep, and the woman's breathing steadied into fragile rhythm. He looked upon them, strangers yet already bound to him by the night's merciless test, and felt the quiet stirring of something he had long thought impossible. A chance, perhaps, not just to rescue another's life, but to find his own again. And so, with snow pressing against the cabin walls and the iron tracks lying silent under the stars, the rancher kept watch, knowing the story had only begun. Morning came pale and gray, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to touch the earth after such a cruel night. The rancher stirred from his chair by the hearth, his body stiff, his eyes raw from keeping watch. The woman still lay on the cot, her dark hair spilling across the blanket, her chest rising shallowly yet steadily. Near the fire, the twins slept close together, swaddled in fresh cloth torn from an old shirt he had sacrificed in the night. Their faces were no longer blue but faintly flushed, as though life itself had crept back into them while the world outside froze. The rancher moved with quiet care, setting water to warm over the flames, breaking pieces of bread into broth, doing what he could to make nourishment from little. When she finally stirred, her eyes opened in a daze, unsure if the cabin around her was real or only another fleeting dream. He offered her a cup with trembling hands, his voice low, the words shaped more like an offering than a command. She drank slowly, her cracked lips pressing to the rim, her gaze never quite meeting his. She was young, but hardship had carved its lines into her before her time. Her skin bore the pallor of hunger, her wrists still raw where the rope had bitten deep. She kept one hand near the twins, as if some unseen force might still try to tear them away. When her voice finally came, it was little more than a whisper, telling fragments of a story without detail, but enough to draw shape from shadows. She had once belonged to a household that judged her value only by her ability to bear children. When her husband faltered and turned cold, his kin turned crueler. They had no mercy when the twins arrived. Rather than offer her aid, they sought to erase her entirely. The rancher listened without interruption. His silence was not indifference but the silence of a man who knew words could wound if used carelessly. He understood enough to know that those who should have stood beside her had cast her aside instead. That knowledge burned within him, though he let no flame of anger touch her ears. She needed calm. She needed space to believe she was safe. Days passed in the rhythm of survival. Snowstorms lashed against the cabin walls, howling like wolves. Inside, the fire kept them alive. The woman's strength began to return little by little, though she still trembled when holding her children too long. The rancher helped where he could, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he held the twins, rocking them with awkward patience, learning their cries as though they spoke a language only a parent could hear. She began to move about the cabin, slowly at first. She fetched water from the basin, folded blankets, prepared what little food there was with careful hands. Each act stitched her back into life. When the storm broke, sunlight spilled across the prairie like gold on silver, and for the first time she stepped outside, the twins bundled close against her chest. She looked out at the open land with eyes filled not with fear but with awe, as though the world was suddenly larger than her sorrow. The rancher worked beside her. He showed her the small tasks of his ranching life, things she had never needed to learn but now seemed to ground her. She carried kindling, learned how to set a lantern wick just right, mended a shirt torn at the sleeve. He found that he did not mind teaching, and in truth he found something like peace in her presence. She listened when he spoke, though he spoke rarely, and her quiet gratitude was enough to fill the silence that had once been unbearable. The twins grew stronger, their cheeks softening, their eyes opening wider to the world. At night, their cries echoed through the cabin, and both adults rose to soothe them, each taking a child in tired arms. The shared exhaustion became its own bond, unspoken but understood. There were moments when their hands brushed as they passed a blanket or when their eyes met over the heads of the infants, and in those brief sparks lay the first fragile threads of trust. The outside world, however, was not so easily kept at bay. When the rancher rode into town for supplies, whispers followed him like shadows. Folks saw the young woman at his side one day when she needed clothes for the babies. Some eyes held pity, but others held judgment sharper than knives. Rumors bloomed in corners, twisting the truth into something ugly. He paid no mind to their tongues, but he knew she felt it, the weight of those unseen stares pressing against her. That night she wept quietly by the fire, the babies sleeping soundly in their makeshift cradle. She wept not for herself alone, but for the fear that her children might grow in a world that saw them as less. The rancher did not speak many words of comfort, for he was not a man of speeches. Instead, he laid his hand gently over hers, steady and grounding. She felt in that touch no pity, no demand, only a firm presence that told her she was not alone. It was enough. Sometimes it was more than enough. The weeks shaped them into something that felt like a household, though neither dared name it aloud. She rose early to stir the fire and prepare what little breakfast they had, while he stepped into the snow to tend the cattle. The twins began to laugh in small bursts of sound that warmed the cabin more than any flame. He built a stronger cradle with his own hands, carving patterns into the wood, though he told himself it was only to pass the time. When she saw it, she pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle her tears. The prairie had a way of testing those who lived upon it, not only with hunger and weather, but with loneliness and the need for human closeness. The rancher had long believed he would end his days in solitude, his name fading like dust on the wind. But as he watched her tend to the babies by firelight, her face softened by warmth instead of fear, he felt something stir deep inside him. It was not a loud thing, not a sudden flame, but a slow-burning ember that spread through him like steady heat. She too began to see what she had not known could exist. He did not demand her gratitude. He did not ask her to prove her worth. He only offered space, steady respect, and the kind of patience she had never known from men before. She found herself smiling faintly when she caught him humming under his breath, or when he stumbled awkwardly while cradling one of the twins. These were small things, but they carried the weight of a new beginning. Yet even as warmth grew in the cabin, shadows lingered beyond its walls. Her past had not disappeared. Those who had cast her away were still out there. She carried the fear of their return like a stone in her chest. The rancher did not press her for details, but he knew the kind of men who would leave a woman tied to tracks were not men who let go easily. He prepared quietly, stacking wood higher, keeping his rifle clean, though he prayed it would not be needed. One evening, when the wind fell still and the prairie lay under a blanket of stars, she whispered that she had not felt safe in years. Her words carried no flourish, no plea, only truth spoken softly in the dark. The rancher, sitting across the fire, looked at her then with eyes steady and unflinching. He said nothing, but in his silence was the weight of a vow. She read it there, unspoken but undeniable, that as long as his breath remained, she and her children would not be left unguarded again. The night grew quiet. The twins sighed in their sleep, the fire hissed, and the prairie stretched endless and silent outside the cabin walls. Though neither of them voiced what lay between them, it was clear to both that something new had begun to take root, fragile yet steady, like the first shoots pushing up through thawing earth. What had started as rescue was becoming something else entirely, and the road ahead, though uncertain, no longer looked so empty. Spring arrived slow across the prairie, as though the earth itself was reluctant to shake off the grip of winter. The snow receded in patches, giving way to damp soil and tender shoots of grass. The rancher's land, once silent and lifeless, began to stir with sound, the bawl of calves, the creak of fences thawing, the wind no longer sharp with ice but soft with the smell of new growth. Inside the cabin, life was no less transformed. The twins had grown stronger, their cries louder, their laughter beginning to echo in bursts that filled the once empty rooms. The woman moved with more ease, no longer pale with hunger but alive with purpose. Days began with shared work. She fetched water while he checked the herd. She mended clothes while he chopped wood. Together they fed the twins, rocking them gently while the fire snapped and hissed. The rhythm of their lives folded into something seamless, as though it had always been this way. Yet beneath the ease, there was a quiet undercurrent neither had named. It lingered in the brush of hands as they passed a child between them, in the shared glances across a meal, in the way their silences no longer weighed heavy but felt companionable. One afternoon he began teaching her to ride his spare horse. At first she gripped the reins too tight, her body stiff with nerves, but he stood nearby, steadying her with calm instructions. His voice was low, patient, never sharp. The horse shifted beneath her, and her breath caught, but he rested his hand lightly on the bridle, his presence steady as the land itself. When she finally found the rhythm of the movement, she laughed, a sound so sudden and bright it startled even her. The rancher, unused to such joy within his walls, felt something loosen in his chest. The trust between them did not bloom overnight. It grew in small acts. When she burned her hand cooking, he wrapped the wound in cloth with hands more gentle than she expected from a man so rugged. When he returned from a long day on the range, she left a lantern lit in the window so he would not ride back to darkness. The twins, too, became bridges between them. Their needs drew the two closer, made them partners without words. She began to see in him not only the man who had saved her life, but the one who now lived beside her in the quiet dailiness of care. Yet the world beyond the cabin did not forget them. The rancher still rode into town for supplies, and she went with him when the babies needed cloth or medicine. Their presence together did not go unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the community, tongues sharp with speculation. Some pitied her, some judged her, and some wondered why a man who had lived alone so long now sheltered a woman with 2 infants not his own. She bore the weight of those stares with shoulders tense, but he never flinched. He walked at her side, head high, his silence louder than any defense. Still, when night fell and they returned home, she wept softly, afraid of what those whispers might mean for her children's future. One evening she sat by the fire, the twins asleep in their wooden cradle, tears streaking her face. She confessed she feared she would always be a burden, a shadow clinging to his life. The rancher sat across from her, his rough hands folded, his eyes steady. He did not speak quickly, but when he finally did, his words were firm. He told her that a burden was something unwanted, something a man carried because he must. She and her children, he said, were not such a weight. They were lives worth keeping safe. The truth of his voice left her trembling. She looked at him then with eyes no longer clouded by fear but lit by something steadier, trust. As the weeks unfurled, that trust deepened. He began building new fences with her help, letting her hold the posts steady while he hammered. She laughed at her own clumsiness when she bent nails, and he found himself smiling more than he had in years. She cooked meals with more skill now, and he began to linger at the table longer after eating, savoring the warmth not only of the food but of the presence across from him. At night, he found himself listening for the sound of her voice as she hummed the twins to sleep, a sound that filled corners of his heart long empty. But shadows of her past still lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. She never spoke names, never told him every detail of what had been done to her, but the fear remained in her eyes. Sometimes, when the wind howled against the cabin, she would clutch the twins too tightly, as if the storm itself might tear them away. He never pressed her, but he cleaned his rifle more often, stacked wood higher, prepared quietly for a threat that might one day come. The prairie, in its way, tested them. One night a calf was lost to the cold, and the rancher returned weary and bitter. He found her rocking the twins, her face pale with worry at his absence. When he stepped inside, she rose and touched his arm without a word. He had expected scolding or pity, but she only offered presence, and it was enough to ease the ache. Another day, when she faltered carrying water, he caught the bucket before it spilled and steadied her with a touch. Their lives became a braid of such moments, each one binding them tighter together. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the land in hues of gold and fire, he brought something into the cabin. A cradle, carved from oak, sturdy and smooth. He had worked on it in the shed during spare hours, shaping it with care, sanding it until his hands blistered. He said little as he placed it by the fire, but his eyes held quiet expectation. She stepped forward, tracing the wood with her fingers, seeing the care etched in every line. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. She turned to him, unable to speak, but he did not need words. The look she gave him carried more weight than any vow. That night, as the twins slept in their new bed, she whispered to him that she had never known such kindness, never believed it could exist. He sat near the fire, gaze steady, and though he did not reach for her, she felt the space between them narrow into something unbreakable. For the first time since the night he found her, she felt the possibility of a future not defined by fear but by belonging. The prairie outside lay quiet, stars stretched endless across the sky. Inside the cabin, warmth spread not just from the fire but from something deeper, something fragile yet growing stronger with each passing day. What had begun as rescue was becoming partnership, and what had once been mere survival was ripening into the first threads of love. The woman closed her eyes, knowing storms might still come, but also knowing she no longer faced them alone. And though neither had spoken the words, both understood. Something worth keeping had been born between them, and it was only just beginning to take shape. You said. Summer rolled over the land with heat that shimmered on the horizon, turning the prairie grass gold. Life on the ranch beat with a steady rhythm now, days marked by the cries of the twins, evenings softened by the hush of the wind through open windows. For the woman, the cabin had grown into something she had never known, a place that felt like home. Yet even as laughter found its way into the rooms and trust settled between her and the rancher, unease shadowed the edges of her days. She carried with her the memory of the in-laws who had bound her to the tracks, and fear lingered that they would return to finish what they had begun. The rancher sensed it too. He spoke of it rarely, but his actions betrayed his thoughts. He kept the rifle clean, sharpened the axe more often than needed, built the fences higher, and worked with a vigilance that had little to do with cattle. He was a man who understood that peace was never guaranteed, especially on the frontier, where cruelty could ride across the prairie as swiftly as any storm. That fear became flesh one evening as dusk bled into night. Lantern light flickered through the cabin's windows while the woman rocked her children in the cradle. The rancher had just come in from the barn, sweat darkening his shirt, when the sound of horses carried on the wind. More than one. Heavy hoofbeats, deliberate and slow. He froze in the doorway, listening. She stiffened, her arms tightening around the twins, for she too knew that sound. The riders emerged from the dark, their figures cut against the fading sky. Torches flared in their hands, casting cruel shadows across familiar faces, the in-laws who had sought to erase her from the world. Their voices carried sharp across the yard, demanding she return, declaring the children theirs by right of blood. The rancher stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him, his frame outlined against the torchlight. He carried no rifle in his arms, only his presence, calm yet unyielding. They called him a thief, accused him of harboring what was not his. He did not answer quickly. He had never been a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice was steady as iron. He told them no child belonged to men who would tie a mother to rails, no woman owed loyalty to those who cast her to die. His words struck like hammer blows, plain and final. The in-laws spat their threats, shifting uneasily in their saddles. Their cruelty was loud, but their courage wavered in the face of his stillness. A figure appeared at the edge of the field, a neighbor, drawn by the commotion, lantern in hand. Soon another came, then another, until a small gathering of townsfolk stood in the shadows, watching. They had seen the whispers in town, heard the rumors, but here before them stood truth, a woman who had been wronged, a man who stood guard over her. And slowly, quietly, the judgment that had once weighed heavy in the town shifted into something else. The in-laws saw it too, that the ground beneath them was no longer firm. The rancher did not raise his hand against them, but his defiance, joined by the silent witness of others, was enough. Their torches sputtered in the night air, their voices faltered, and at last, with muttered curses, they turned their horses and rode off into the dark, their shadows swallowed by the prairie. Silence settled after the echo of hoofbeats faded. The rancher stood still a long moment, then turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the woman had not moved from the cradle, her face wet with tears, the twins pressed close to her chest. When he stepped through the doorway, she rose, trembling, and for the first time she let herself collapse into his arms. She wept openly, not only from fear but from relief. She whispered that she had never been defended before, that no one had ever stood so firmly for her. He held her as though she were the only soul in the world, his rough hands steady against her back, and in his chest something long silent broke open into certainty. In the days that followed, talk spread through the town. The attempted claim of the in-laws became a story retold at tables and wells, and with each retelling, the rancher's name carried new weight, not the name of a lonely man, but of one who had chosen to protect and to keep. The whispers that once judged the woman turned softer, laced with respect, even admiration. The tide of opinion shifted, and with it, a space opened for something greater to take root. The rancher did not ask in haste, for he was not a man to rush words of such gravity. But one evening, as the twins slept and the prairie lay beneath a sky blooming with stars, he turned to her. His voice was rough, halting at first, but steady in its truth. He told her that he wanted her not as burden or guest but as partner, as wife, as family. He asked if she would bind her life to his, not out of obligation but out of choice. Her answer came not in speech but in the way she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling yet firm. She looked at him with eyes that had known sorrow, rejection, near death, and now saw before her a man who had not only saved her life but given her reason to live it fully. Her yes was silent, but it rang louder than any word could have. The wedding was held weeks later, simple yet profound. In the small prairie church, neighbors gathered, some bringing wildflowers, others bringing food. The twins, swaddled in cloth sewn anew, cooed softly as the vows were spoken. The rancher stood in his best shirt, the woman in a dress mended carefully by kindly hands from town. The air was thick with warmth, not from grandeur but from sincerity. Bells rang gently, and when they stepped outside, the prairie stretched endless and bright, as though blessing the union. From that day, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter against loneliness but a home. The laughter of children grew louder with each season, the walls alive with warmth and song. She found her strength not only in surviving but in belonging, and he discovered that love, once thought lost to him, had been waiting quietly at the edges of his life, waiting for a night by the tracks to be awakened. Years would pass, storms would come and go, cattle would be raised and lost, but the bond forged in that first rescue and sealed by their vows would remain steady. The prairie had tested them, but it had also given them to each other. And for those who heard the story told by firelight in later years, it became more than a tale of cruelty overcome. It became proof of a truth as old as the land itself, that even in the harshest places, kindness can carve out a refuge, and love, when guarded with patience and respect, can grow strong enough to outlast every storm. If this tale touched your heart, give it a like and let it live a little longer. Subscribe to hear more Wild West stories whispered across the prairie. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every word adds to the Firelight Circle. From these wide open plains to wherever you are, the story rides on.